On findings being published in a new book out today on the Shroud of Turin. That's the linen cloth believed to bear Jesus' imprint as he was being prepared for burial. And now there's new research that may disprove the claim of people who've said it's an elaborate fake.
He was wrapped in linen, and then his body was placed in the tomb. In 1978, a Jewish photographer walked into a cathedral in Turin, Italy, expecting to debunk the most famous relic in Christianity. His name was Barry Schwarz. Born in Pittsburgh, raised in a strict Orthodox Jewish home, 2 sets of dishes, 2 sets of silverware, grandparents in the house, bar mitzvah at 13, he wasn't religious anymore. He hadn't thought about God in years, and he had zero interest in Jesus Christ, the resurrection, or any relic associated with either. But Schwarz was one of the best scientific photographers in America. And when a team of 33 scientists assembled to examine the Shroud of Turin, the 14-foot linen cloth that millions believe wrapped the body of Jesus after crucifixion, they needed a photographer without bias. No agenda, no emotional attachment, just the lens and the data. Schwarz tried to quit twice. He told the team leader, "Why would a Jewish man want to get involved with what is probably the most important relic in Christianity?" A NASA imaging scientist named Don Lin looked at him and said, "Have you forgotten that the man in question was also a Jew?" Then he added 5 words that would define the next 46 years of Schwarz's life. God doesn't tell us in advance. He went to Turin expecting to see paint, expecting brushstrokes. Within the first hour of examining the cloth, he knew it wasn't a painting, but he still didn't believe it was real, because there was one thing about the shroud that made no sense. One detail that kept him skeptical for 17 more years. The blood on the cloth was red, not brown, not black, not the color every forensic scientist will tell you ancient blood turns after decades, let alone centuries. Red. Standing over that cloth in 1978, Schwarz looked at his colleague Vern Miller, and they both shook their heads. They could see the doubt in each other's eyes. Old blood doesn't stay red. Something was wrong. It would take 17 years, a phone call from a dying Jewish blood chemist, and a single word, Billy Rubin, to break Barry Schwartz's resistance and force him to accept what the evidence had been telling him all along. That phone call is coming, but not yet. Because the story of the Shroud doesn't begin with Schwarz. It begins in a dark room in 1898, with a man who nearly dropped a priceless glass plate when he saw what appeared on it. Because the face staring back at him from the negative was impossible. May 28th, 1898. The Cathedral of St. John the Baptist, Turin. An amateur photographer named Secondo Pia had been granted rare permission by King Umberto I to photograph the shroud during a royal exhibition. Photography in 1898 was brutal. No digital sensors, no preview screens. Pia hauled a camera the size of a suitcase onto scaffolding inside the cathedral, used violent magnesium flashes, and exposed 2 massive glass plates, each about 20 by 24 inches. Late that night, alone in his dark room, lit only by the faint red glow of a safety lamp, Pia lowered a plate into developing chemicals, and as the image materialized on the glass, he nearly dropped it. On a photographic negative, everything reverses. Light becomes dark, dark becomes light. Faces become ghoulish, distorted. Flat masks with hollow eyes. That's the fundamental law. The shroud broke it. What appeared was not a distortion. It was a portrait. A sharp, detailed, hauntingly realistic face. Eyes gently closed, a broken nose, bruising along the right cheek, a mustache, a forked beard. An expression of devastating calm on someone who had endured extreme suffering. It looked like a photograph of a real human being, taken centuries before photography existed. Here's what that means. The image on the cloth itself is already a negative. A negative of a negative becomes a positive, and that positive image, hidden inside the tonal reversal for centuries, is anatomically accurate, proportionally correct, and detailed beyond anything any known artistic method can explain. Now ask the question that shattered a century of easy dismissal. Who in the medieval world, 800 years before photography, understood the concept of a photographic negative? Who could create a flawless reversed image across 14 feet of linen without any way to see, test, or verify the result? The human eye cannot perceive the world in negative. The human brain cannot compose an image in reverse tonal values. No medieval artist had any reason to attempt this. No modern artist has successfully replicated it. That single photograph was the first crack in the wall. The Shroud didn't behave like a painting. It behaved like something without a name. For 78 years, that anomaly sat unanswered. Then, in 1976, two Air Force physicists pointed a machine built for mapping Mars at the image. And the question got much worse. February 1976. Air Force Academy, Colorado Springs. Physicists John Jackson and Eric Jumper fed a photograph of the Shroud into a VP8 image analyzer, a Cold War device that converts image brightness into three-dimensional terrain relief, built for mapping planetary surfaces from satellite data. You feed it a flat image. Bright areas rise, dark areas sink. It generates a topographic model. They had already tested dozens of images, paintings, photographs, sketches, X-rays. Everyone produced meaningless garbage, distorted blobs with no spatial coherence. Because in a normal image, brightness represents reflected light, not distance. A bright spot on a face doesn't mean that part of the face is physically closer. It means light hit it at a certain angle. The VP8 can't translate that into meaningful 3D data. The Shroud did. It produced a perfect three-dimensional human body. Peter Schumacher, the engineer who built the VP8, had never heard of the Shroud. No religious background, no stake in the outcome. His conclusion? The results were unlike anything he had ever processed through the analyzer, before or since. A geometrically accurate form. Nose, cheekbones, brow ridge, chest, crossed hands, legs, all contoured correctly. Rotatable, without distortion. Image intensity at every point corresponded precisely to the distance between the body and the cloth, not reflected light. Distance. Three-dimensional spatial data, encoded into ancient linen. In nearly 50 years since, no image, painted, photographed, or digitally generated, has ever reproduced this result. Not one. Only about 60 VP8 units were ever built. Only 2 still work. And the question remains, how do you encode distance information into fabric without any technology that existed before the 20th century? If you're already asking how that's possible, subscribe to Stone and Bone. We follow the evidence to the end, and this story has a long way to go, because the image was strange, but the blood was something else entirely. So while they dismiss the idea that the Shroud is evidence of a miracle, they can't explain how the image was made. This is a very simple technique that was available in the Middle Ages and required no technologies, no strange theories or equipment. Remember Schwarz standing over the Shroud in 1978, staring at bloodstains that were the wrong color? He wasn't alone. The full STURP team, the Shroud of Turin Research Project, 33 scientists from Los Alamos National Laboratory, Jet Propulsion Laboratory, Sandia National Laboratories, and the Air Force Academy, spent 120 continuous hours examining the cloth. They ran X-ray fluorescence, infrared spectroscopy, ultraviolet photography, and microchemical analysis. When they finished, chemists John Heller and Alan Adler performed 12 diagnostic tests on the samples. Heller's reaction, when the spectral curve confirmed hemoglobin, the hair stood up on the back of my neck. Real blood, not paint, not ochre. They confirmed hemoglobin, albumin, and hemiporphyrin derivatives. They found serum halos, the pale rings that form when blood separates as it dries. Halos no medieval painter would think to reproduce, because the phenomenon wasn't understood until modern forensics. And here's the detail that eliminates every forgery theory in one stroke. The blood was on the cloth before the image formed. Underneath the bloodstains, there is no body image. None. Blood first. Image second. A forger paints the body first, then adds blood on top. Every artist in history works that way. The Shroud does it backwards. That sequence alone eliminates painting, rubbing, printing, and every contact transfer method ever proposed. but the blood told a darker story. In 2017, researchers at the University of Padua examined Shroud blood fibers at the atomic level using transmission electron microscopy. They reported finding creatinine nanoparticles at concentrations associated with extreme physical trauma, a condition known as rhabdomyolysis, the breakdown of skeletal muscle under severe stress. The implication? The person whose blood is on this cloth had undergone intense physical suffering, even before crucifixion. That aligns with the Roman practice of scourging, using a flagrum, a whip embedded with metal weights and bone fragments. The shroud shows over 100 scourge marks, consistent with two attackers striking from alternating sides. Now, it's important to be honest here. That 2017 study was later retracted in 2018 due to procedural concerns. Not proven fraud, but still contested, and that matters. Because this channel follows the evidence wherever it leads, strong or weak. The nail wounds are through the wrists, not the palms. Every painting you've ever seen, Giotto, Michelangelo, Rubens, shows nails through the palms. But in the 1930s, French surgeon Pierre Barbet conducted experiments on cadavers. He demonstrated that palm tissue cannot support the weight of a human body. The nails tear through. Crucifixion requires placement through the wrist, specifically the intercarpal space, where the bones can bear the load. And every time Barbet drove a nail through that space, the same thing happened. The median nerve was damaged. The thumb snapped violently inward. Barbet described it precisely. An immediate contraction forcing the thumb into the palm, where it would remain fixed after rigor mortis. Now, look at the shroud. Count the fingers. 4. Not 5. The thumbs are hidden, tucked into the palms. Exactly what you'd expect from median nerve damage. No medieval artist knew this. No one understood this until modern anatomical studies. Every crucifixion painting in history gets this detail wrong. The shroud gets it right. Before this video, what did you think? Palms or wrists? Because every image you've ever seen told you one thing. The shroud tells you another. And then there's the blood type. AB, one of the rarest blood types in the world, about 3% of the global population. That same blood type appears on a completely separate cloth, one with a story that should give every skeptic serious pause. In the Cathedral of San Salvador, in the city of Oviedo in northern Spain, there is another cloth, smaller, about 33 by 21 inches, no image on it, just blood and fluid stains. It's called the Sudarium of Oviedo, the face cloth. Its documented history traces back to at least 570 CE, with records of its journey from Jerusalem in 614 CE, fleeing the Persian invasion. And here's a detail that puts this in perspective. On March 14th, 1075, the chest containing the Sudarium was officially opened in a ceremony witnessed by King Alfonso VI of Leon. Standing beside him was Rodrigo Diaz de Vivar, the man history knows as El Cid, one of the most documented figures of the medieval period. That's not legend, that's a recorded historical event, with named witnesses. 2 cloths, 2 countries, 2 completely separate chains of custody, one in Turin, one in northern Spain. They have never been in the same room, and yet, blood type AB on both. Stain patterns that match the facial dimensions on the shroud. When overlaid using modern imaging techniques, researchers have reported dozens of points of correspondence, on both the front and back. Fluid flow patterns suggest a nose length of about 3 inches, consistent across both cloths. Puncture wounds around the head region align with what would be expected from sharp thorns. If these 2 cloths covered the same face, then the implication is massive. Because the Sudarium, with its documented existence centuries before the medieval period, would challenge the idea that the shroud is a later fabrication. To fake both, you would need 2 artifacts in 2 different countries, with matching blood type, matching wound patterns, matching anatomical proportions, all before the existence of forensic science. The blood tells you how this man died. The DNA tells you something different. Something unexpected. It tells you where this cloth has been. In 2015, geneticist Gianni Barcaccia and his team analyzed dust particles taken from within the Shroud's fibers. They sequenced mitochondrial DNA. If the cloth were a simple medieval European forgery, European DNA should dominate. If it had remained only in the Middle East, Middle Eastern DNA should dominate. Neither happened. Instead, genetic traces from across the world, Europe, the Middle East, North and East Africa, South Asia, East Asia, multiple haplogroups, suggesting contact with diverse populations over long periods of time. One interpretation: the cloth didn't stay in one place. It traveled. Historical traditions describe a journey from Jerusalem to Edessa, an ancient city along major trade routes, then to Constantinople, the capital of the Byzantine Empire, a crossroads of civilizations, a place where relics were displayed, touched, venerated. Every contact, leaving microscopic traces. After the Fourth Crusade, the cloth disappears from clear historical record, then reappears in France in the 14th century. The DNA may reflect centuries of movement, a kind of biological passport, not a single origin, but a long history of exposure. And then there's the pollen. Researchers, including Max Fry, reported identifying pollen grains from dozens of plant species on the cloth, some European, but many associated with the Middle East, including species that grow in the region between Jerusalem and Jericho. One plant often mentioned, Gundalia tournefortii, a thorny plant found in that area. Its pollen was reported in higher concentrations near the head region. Some have suggested a possible link to a crown of thorns. But, like much of this evidence, interpretations remain debated. The DNA suggests movement. The pollen suggests geography. The blood suggests trauma. But one test, decades ago, seemed to settle everything, and it said the opposite. 3 major laboratories, the University of Arizona, the University of Oxford, and ETH Zurich, each received samples from the Shroud, radiocarbon dating. The goal and the debate, the result, 1260 to 1390 CE, medieval, with 95% confidence. Published in the journal Nature. Headlines around the world. Case closed. On October 13, 1988, Oxford physicist Edward Hall presented the findings publicly. He suggested the cloth was simply a medieval creation, a relic, made, not discovered. But almost immediately questions began to surface, not necessarily about the labs, but about the sample itself. Because the piece that was tested came from a single corner of the cloth, an area some researchers later argued may have been repaired in the Middle Ages after damage. If true, that sample might not represent the original fabric. That possibility remains one of the central points of debate today. This is where the story changes, because from this point forward, it's no longer just about evidence. It's about interpretation, methodology, and whether one test can outweigh everything else. A chair funded by donors who celebrated the result. That's not proof of misconduct, but it is the kind of institutional entanglement that, in any other field, would raise serious questions about conflicts of interest. The Church stepped back. Pope John Paul II quietly reclassified the Shroud, not as a relic, but as an icon. The scientific community moved on. Case closed. But the test had a problem, a structural problem, visible from the very beginning. The original 1986 protocol called for 7 laboratories, multiple sample sites from different areas of the cloth, blind testing, supervised by 3 independent institutions. By the time negotiations were finished, the protocol had been reduced to 3 labs, 1 sample site, 1 supervising body, the British Museum. The blind test was abandoned because the Shroud's distinctive herringbone weave made it instantly recognizable. That single sample came from the most handled corner of the entire cloth, the very edge that bishops and cardinals had gripped during public exhibitions for centuries, soaked in sweat, candle wax, incense smoke, the oils of countless hands. Enter Raymond Rogers, not a believer, a senior scientist at Los Alamos National Laboratory, lead chemist for Stirpe in 1978. a founding editor of Thermochimica Acta. When researchers proposed in 2000 that the carbon-dated sample came from a medieval repair, Rogers dismissed it as nonsense. He set out to disprove them. Then he examined the threads. Comparing fibers from the tested corner with threads from other parts of the cloth, samples he had personally collected decades earlier, Rogers found something unexpected. They were chemically different. The carbon-dated sample contained cotton, Gossypium herbaceum, a Near Eastern species, cotton that was absent from the rest of the shroud. It was also coated with a yellow-brown plant gum, containing alizarin dye derived from madder root, bound with gum arabic, materials found nowhere else on the cloth. The implication, after the 1532 fire, medieval repairs may have been carried out with remarkable skill, weaving new cotton threads into the original linen, dyeing them to match, bonding them with plant gum to make the repair invisible. And the radiocarbon labs? They may have dated the repair, not the original cloth. Rogers published his findings in 2005. His conclusion was direct. The radiocarbon sample was not representative. The date was not reliable. Using vanillin analysis, a compound that degrades in linen over time, he found the main body of the shroud had no detectable vanillin, similar to ancient textiles like the Dead Sea Scrolls, but the tested corner still contained it. His estimated age for the main cloth, between 1,300 and 3,000 years. Raymond Rogers died in March 2005, 2 months after publishing his paper. But the story doesn't end there, because for 30 years after the 1988 test, the raw data was withheld, the most important archaeological test in modern history, and the underlying measurements were locked away. Researchers requested access. They were denied. Freedom of information requests were deflected for decades. Then, in 2017, a French researcher, Tristan Casabianca, used British FOI law to obtain the data, 711 pages. What he found, published in 2019 in Archaeometry, was troubling. The data was not consistent. One lab alone had made far more measurements than were reported in the original paper. Different parts of the same small sample produced radiocarbon dates that varied significantly across just a small section of fabric. The statistical agreement was low, much lower than expected for a result claimed at 95% confidence. The conclusion wasn't that the shroud had been proven real, but that the 1988 test was not as definitive as the headlines claimed. Then, in 2022, another approach. Liberato De Caro applied a different dating method: wide-angle X-ray scattering. Instead of measuring carbon isotopes, it analyzes how cellulose in linen degrades at the atomic level over time. He compared the shroud fibers with fabrics of known ages, including textiles from Masada, destroyed in 73 CE. His result: the shroud's structural properties aligned more closely with first-century samples than with medieval ones. Meanwhile, textile expert Mechtilde Fleury-Lemberg examined the stitching. She identified a technique she had only seen once before, on ancient textiles from Masada. So, now the question changes. Did you think the shroud was debunked? Most people do. The 1988 headlines were everywhere. The follow-up barely made the news. If this is the first time you're hearing that the carbon dating is debated, ask yourself why. Because everything so far, DNA, pollen, blood, dating, is extraordinary. But the deepest mystery is still the image itself. After more than 40 years of testing, no laboratory on Earth can fully explain how it was made. Here's what the shroud image is not. Not paint, no pigments, dyes, or stains found. Not a scorch, thermal burns behave differently under ultraviolet light. Not a photograph. It encodes three-dimensional data no camera can produce. Not a vapor imprint. Those create blurred, diffuse patterns. The image exists only on the outermost layer of the linen fibers, about 200 nanometers deep, thinner than a bacterium. It's not applied, it's altered. A chemical change in the cellulose, oxidation and dehydration at the surface level. Each fiber is either colored or not. A binary structure, like pixels, like a half-tone image. No brush strokes, no directionality, no liquid penetration, and it appears only on the front and back surfaces, not along the sides, not wrapping around the body, as if whatever formed it operated vertically. In 1981, the STURP team wrote something rare in science. Some explanations that worked chemically failed physically, and some that worked physically failed chemically. Their conclusion: the mechanism remains unknown. That was 1981. Since then, Italy's ENEA research agency attempted replication, using high-powered excimer lasers in the deep ultraviolet range. Paolo Di Lazzaro and his team managed to produce superficial coloration on linen fibers, but only under extreme conditions. Energy levels far beyond what any known natural or historical process could generate. Even then, they couldn't reproduce the full image, and that leaves us here. An image with no known mechanism, blood with forensic detail, a history that spans continents, a test that said medieval, and evidence that says not so simple. So the question isn't just, what is the shroud? The real question is, what kind of event could leave behind something like this? Tiny patches that resembled the shroud's characteristics. But to reproduce the full body image, covering roughly 2,600 square inches, researchers calculated it would require a simultaneous energy pulse of 34 trillion watts, lasting less than a billionth of a second, powerful enough to alter the chemistry of the cloth's surface, yet precise enough not to burn the fibers beneath. No technology on Earth can produce that. Paolo Di Lazzaro was direct. Their research showed it is almost impossible to replicate all the characteristics of the image using any technology, medieval or modern. A standing challenge remains. Filmmaker David Rolfe has offered a $1 million prize to anyone who can reproduce the shroud image with all its properties. No one has claimed it. And then there's the fire, the detail almost no one gives enough weight. December 3rd, 1532. Fire engulfed the chapel in Chambéry, France. The shroud was stored inside a silver reliquary, locked behind an iron grill. Silver melts at 961 degrees Celsius. By the time rescuers reached it, part of the container had already liquefied. Molten silver dripped onto the folded cloth, burning through it, leaving symmetry. Water used to extinguish the flames left stains across the fabric. The burn marks framed the body image, but the image itself survived. Fire destroys paint, destroys ink, destroys dye, destroys pigment, destroys every known artistic medium. It did not destroy this. Whatever formed the image, it isn't something fire can consume. It's not applied, it's embedded, a rearrangement of the atoms already in the linen, and it endured molten silver. Now, go back to Barry Schwarz, 17 years of doubt. One final question. Why was the blood still red? Mid-1990s, a phone call. On the other end, Alan Adler, a leading expert in porphyrins, the chemistry at the core of blood, also Jewish, also not trying to prove anything. After years of analysis, Adler found the answer. High concentrations of bilirubin. Bilirubin is produced when the body breaks down red blood cells, normally present in small amounts, but under extreme trauma, severe injury, prolonged torture, the body floods the bloodstream with it, and bilirubin changes blood. It binds to hemoglobin in a way that slows oxidation. Normal blood turns brown, then black. But blood rich in bilirubin can remain red far longer. The implication? The man whose blood is on the cloth experienced extreme physical trauma. When Schwarz heard that, everything clicked. 17 years of skepticism, gone. Not because of belief, because of chemistry. He later described it simply. The final piece of evidence had arrived. And then something remarkable happened. He accepted the evidence. But he did not convert. Barry Schwarz remained Jewish his entire life. He didn't adopt Christianity. He didn't treat the shroud as a religious object. He treated it as evidence. In 1996, he launched Shroud.com, one of the earliest and largest archives dedicated to the shroud, decades before most modern websites. In a 2013 talk at the Vatican, he said something that stayed with people. I truly believe that only God would choose a Jewish man. with no emotional attachment to Jesus, to be on that team. Then he paused and smiled. Isn't it funny how God always seems to pick a Jew to be the messenger? He called himself exactly that, a messenger. Barry Schwarz died in June 2024, after nearly half a century studying one object. He never wavered, and he never converted. Now step back. Look at everything together. Biology, chemistry, physics, genetics, botany, forensic medicine, different fields, different decades, different researchers, all pointing to the same questions. An image unlike any known method of creation, blood with measurable chemical properties, a complex history of handling and movement. Scientific tests, some supporting, some challenging, many debated. So what is it? I'm not telling you the Shroud is authentic, and I'm not telling you it's fake. I'm telling you something simpler. The evidence is more complicated than most people think. Inside a cathedral in Turin, behind protective glass, preserved in controlled conditions, a piece of linen remains. On it, an image no one can fully explain. Blood that still raises questions. Traces of history, layered over centuries. It doesn't demand belief. It doesn't force conclusions. It simply exists. And after everything you've heard, the real question isn't what you were told before. It's this. What do you think now?